You got this. The Lord is working.
Well, it's good because I closed my eyes and I lost my page number on this. Oh, got it. Here you go. All right. Calvary Recap number 4. So great to be with you. I hope you enjoyed your Easter weekend. Super pumped about Easter. We had a sunrise service. We had quite a few people get baptized. Then we had our services at the church, 9 and 11. And we talked about this idea of the resurrection. But before I get into that, the question is, why do we celebrate Easter the way it is? And I love this book. I've read it a couple of times. Justo Gonzalez's book, The Story of Christianity. You can see it right here. If you're on the podcast, keep looking at your podcast feed and it'll pop up magically. No, I'm just joking, it won't. But The Story of Christianity, and this is what he says here. Great book on the beginnings of Christianity, how it started. This is what he says, page 111. At the beginning, Christian calendar was rather simple and was basically a weekly calendar. Every Sunday was sort of an Easter and a day of joy, and every Friday was a day of penance, fasting, and sorrow. Rather early, the reasons that are not altogether clear, Wednesday became a day of fasting. There was a very special Sunday once a year, the day after a day of resurrection, the greatest of the Christian celebrations. Unfortunately, Christians are not in agreement as to when the great day was to be celebrated. For some thought it should be set in accordance with the Jewish Passover, while others believe that it should always be celebrated on a Sunday. But here's the interesting thing. By the 2nd century, there was a bitter debate about the matter. To this day, although for other reasons, not all churches agree on the manner in which the day of Easter Sunday is to be determined. So part of what they would do at Easter in the 2nd century and before is they would baptize converts. So you would have Easter Sunday, this day that was debated. Should we celebrate it every Sunday? Should it be celebrated once a year? And then if it is celebrated once a year, when do we celebrate it? How does that work? They did know one thing, though, that Easter was a time of new birth. And so they would have this moment where they would publicly recognize that through a commandment that Jesus gave, which is go and baptize the nations in the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So you have this moment where you have baptism. So that's what we did. So 2,000 years on Easter Sunday, we're baptizing people like the church did 2,000 years ago. And so baptism is not as weird as maybe it might sound. Baptism is just what I believe, an outward sign of something inwardly that God has already done. How that would work at that time and was that they would have to recite some type of creed. And it was a way for them to wrestle through maybe some thoughts they had, but it was a way to recognize that this is what they really believe. So baptism was a sign that they believe this. Some people think in the book of Philippians chapter 2, when Paul talks about Christ and he emptied himself, that was part of a creed that they had to recite. Either Paul came up with it or the church in Philippi came up with it. But nonetheless, Easter, a powerful moment for the church, but also just a great opportunity to celebrate the resurrection. Now here's where I was challenged in thinking about all of this. A couple of years ago, thinking about the resurrection, I asked myself, what does the word resurrection actually mean? Is it when I die, I just become a spirit and I float off into space with a toga and a harp or an accordion or something like that? What does resurrection mean? Does it mean I'm just singing all the time in heaven? And what is really heaven? So, a really great book. I'll encourage you. This is kind of hard to read. I'm not saying it's hard to read for me. Let's put it that way. I'm not saying you wouldn't have a hard time reading this. The book is over 700 pages long. It's called The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. And N.T. Wright's a historian, so he's well-versed, and a lot of the book is a tremendous amount of work in ancient Greek writings of antiquity, and also early first century writings. And what he does is he looks at the word of the resurrection. What does resurrection mean? Now, in a smaller book right here, Surprised by Hope, N.T. Wright writes Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church. In this book, Surprised by Hope, this is what N.T. Wright says. When the early Christians spoke of Jesus being raised from the dead, the natural meaning of that statement throughout the ancient world was the claim that something had happened to Jesus would have happened to nobody else. The pagan world would assume it was impossible. The Jewish world believed it would happen eventually, but knew perfectly well that it had not been done yet. So N.T. Wright says, when the word resurrection was used, this is what it meant to the pagans. Impossibility, and who would want it? The Jewish people well, it's eventually going to happen. Well, what's going to happen? And this is what Wright says. Resurrection in the first century meant this: someone physically thoroughly dead becoming physically thoroughly alive. Now, the pagans, or just different Greek mythology, whether from Plato all the way back to Homer in their writings, Plato didn't want a physical body. The physical world, I don't want any of that. To attain something is to be spiritual. But Jesus rose physically. And the word resurrection, that's what it means. Something that was alive and then physically dies and then physically is alive again, but it has a physical body. The Jewish world thought, well, this will happen. It was and Martha was talking to Jesus, and they're talking about Lazarus and his brother, with Martha's brother had passed, and she's like, well, I know he'll come back alive in the resurrection. And Jesus says, well, let me show you what the resurrection is really all about. And he raises him, someone that's dead, back to life, which I think was a kind of a sign of what he was ultimately going to do through himself. He is the prototype, the example of what it means to have physical life. And so Jesus raising from the dead, as he raised from the dead, he's physical body, and he goes to the disciples and he's like, look at me, I have a physical body. And here's the beautiful thing about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When Jesus comes to them and says, I'm physically alive again, and they're like, yeah, you're not. You're a ghost, you're a hallucination, I really don't believe that you're physically alive. So the challenge that the disciples had, Jesus was challenging their doubts in their mind, and he's like, and he was there physically alive, and he's like, I can prove to you I'm physically alive. He goes, can a ghost eat food? And he goes, give me some fish. And so he eats some fish, and they're like, yeah, I guess a ghost can't do that. And Jesus challenged his disciples on every step of the way in their doubts. And so the beautiful thing about the resurrection promises us, because Jesus is the first one. He conquers death and conquers the enemy. And the beautiful thing for us is in resurrection, we will have a new body. We'll be new. And so what a beautiful topic to talk about, the resurrection, the power of the resurrection, and what the resurrection means for us. Last thing I want to talk about is this in our Calvary Recap. We are doing a May 18th. It's like a 3-part series on faith, doubt, and faith in the modern world. So faith and doubt, and how does faith work in the modern world? If you've ever have questions about faith or doubt and you want to know more about that, we encourage you to sign up. It's May 18th, 2019. Not sure when you're watching this video. Here at Calvary Chapel St. Petersburg, we would love for you to come out as we talk about faith, doubt, and faith in the modern world. Other than that, we had a great weekend. We're looking forward to another great weekend this weekend. We'd love for you to join us here at Calvary Chapel St. Petersburg, and we will see you then.
The road mic, baby.
Yeah, but I stopped. I was on a roll.